Individuals who address the soul need to make imperative that we address that person appropriately, because to add to that individual who is poor in spirit, who is in need of encouragement in an admonishing and in corrective way because of what they've experienced. And encouragement doesn't necessarily always mean frou-frou-y, you're gonna be okay. Sometimes encouragement looks like telling the truth, even if it's a hard truth. It requires the acknowledgement that evil has been done to you, that someone else's, that your dis-ease is coming because someone else has chosen to participate in conduct which doesn't align with reality, and you can sense it. That is what is causing the dis-ease.
Welcome to The Renewed Mind, the podcast where we explore the world of biblical counseling and bridge the gap to a more holistic understanding of how scripture, psychology, and counseling intersect. The Renewed Mind is here to provide insightful discussions, interviews, and transformative ideas that align with the wisdom of scripture. And now your hosts, Dr. Luther Smith and Madeline Clark.
Hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are and whatever you are doing. Welcome to the Renewed Mind podcast. We are your hosts. My name is Dr. Luther Smith.
My name is Maddie Clark. Thank you for listening to the Renewed Mind podcast.
Well, the last time we were here, Maddie Madeline, you weren't here. You were gone being responsible and taking care of school things, and so I did miss you, by the way, particularly with our topic. We'll get to kind of the summation of what the topic was right after we talk about where you can reach us. You can reach us at the Renewed Mind podcast at Facebook. That is the RE-NYOO-ED mind. That is on Facebook. Don't forget those hyphens. You can also reach us on Rumble, X, YouTube, and TikTok at the Renewed Mind podcast, all one word. And you can also find clips of the show there. Some takes. I don't know if they're hot takes, but there certainly are takes, particularly on X. And you can also see us on Instagram as well, where we upload clips of the show and all of that. So let's go ahead and jump into what I discussed or talked about last week, and then we'll jump into our topic, because I believe that a large portion of our topic is going to take up just about all of our time. I mean, this is a very nuanced topic we're going to be talking about as it concerns mental illness and a biblical perspective. But before we do that, let's go ahead and talk about what we examined, or what I examined last week. Last week, we had looked at a video. It was about a five-minute video, something along those lines. And it was a guy by the name of Paul Shalalan, I think his last name was. And he has a ministry out in Africa and is a missionary out there. And he had created a video, a biblical counseling video, kind of explaining kind of the major tenets of biblical counseling and how he believed it contrasted with psychology. And although he made some really good points, particularly about the explanation of psychology and what it is, I believe that he had some limitations in his explanation of the difference between biblical counseling and psychology. And we went through that video in great detail, and I mentioned that his perspective of psychology is not a worldview. Psychology is a field of study. It is an observational discipline, and that one's philosophical perspective governs that field of study. And we've talked about that. I know, Maddie Madeline, we've talked about that over the course of this Renewed Mind podcast for a couple of episodes. And so he was kind of mixing and matching the field of study with the philosophical perspective. And then we went to the scriptures, and then we found that the Hebrew word nephesh, found in Genesis 2, which is translated living being or soul. If we went to the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, we found that word nephesh coincides with the Greek word suke, which is where we get the word, or one of the words that make up the word psychology. So I made the case that psychology actually occurs at the very beginning in Genesis 2 with the creation of humanity, that we are a whole being, and that psychology, the reason why it's defined the way it is in this day and age is because of the philosophical perspective that governs it. So, along that note, I want to grease the skids, and now we're going to talk about mental illness and looking at it from a biblical perspective. Now, I have to preface something that I think is important, Maddie Madeline, that if you have not seen the 2 episodes that we did a couple of weeks ago. The first episode was the 2 aspects of sin and counseling biblically, and the 2 natures of humanity and counseling biblically. I would encourage you to go back and watch those first and then come back and watch this, because there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to bring up that are going to be pulled from those 2 episodes specifically. If you watch this without watching those, you might be a little confused and might go, wait, what do you mean? Passive, active? What is that? So I would encourage you to go back and watch those and then come back and watch this, because we will be, if you think we are nuanced now, wait till we get to this, because we're going to be unpacking all sorts of concepts. 2 episodes specifically. So let's go ahead and slide in and talk about mental illness and the etymology of the word. Of course, we always like to define terms when we're talking about a particular concept so that we're all on the same page. So let's talk about the word mental and then talk about the word illness, and then we'll kind of bring them together. And then we'll also contrast it with mental health too. We might as well define that as well. So the word mental, that is the English word mental, comes from the early 15th century. And the word itself means in, of, or pertaining to the mind. It comes from the Latin word mentalis or mentialis. Now, what's interesting about this particular word, Maddie Madeline, is that this word mental has an association with the soul, which is rather fascinating. It's also underscored in spirituality. That is the quality of being spiritual too. So when we are studying, or when we're looking at the word mental, we're looking at the activity of the mind that is found in the soul, or it is the quality of the soul. Really. What are your thoughts on that? Have you heard of this particular word mental being expressed in that way? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think most of the time when we think about mental health or mental illness, which are kind of 2 sides of the same coin, there is a disconnect in our culture and churchianity oftentimes between mental health, mental illness, and then the church and Christianity. And that, we talk about wanting to grow our spiritual health or wanting to grow our mental health. And that particular language in the English does have a little bit of nuance to it as to what particular tools oftentimes maybe we would use for one over the other. However, there is overlap in terms of what, like you mentioned, I find it interesting that word, there's a connection between that word mental and then the soul. As we talked about in a previous episode, that immaterial part, the nephesh, the soul, the thing that brings the life. Mental health oftentimes has a lot to do with our thinking and a lot to do with how we are thinking and viewing and processing and understanding and perceiving the world around us. And that aspect of our understanding, culturally speaking, of mental takes a step further when we say it is connected to your nephesh, to your soul, and to your mind. And the distinction between just the activity of the brain and then the mind and the soul, which encompasses the totality of your immaterial being. And I find that very nuanced distinction important for a number of reasons. And I think we're going to end up kind of covering that a little bit. But is that an accurate kind of representation of that distinction of there is this, the cognitive neurons going off, and then the activity of which occurs in the mind, the soul.
I would agree with that. Again, we have not really talked about how the immaterial and the material kind of work together, but we do see that there is an aspect of the immaterial and the material working if mental is defined as pertaining to the mind, right? And it is of the mind or of the soul, then we are talking about an activity that occurs within the whole individual, not just its separate parts. So I think that you are right there, that there is the mind and then there's the brain, and they work together.
I was just going to summarize what you said real quick, because I think that that is going to be a key thing. That mental health has to do with the whole human, the immaterial and the material.
That is
and
correct.
that there is, because it is addressing the soul, the thing which gives the being life, it is addressing physical, material, behavioral, immaterial, in terms of thinking, in terms of relationship with God, in terms of relationship with self. Mental health and mental illness has to address the totality of the human being, not just the thinking.
I would definitely underscore that. As a matter of fact, let's talk about the word illness, and then let's talk about the word health and smash these two things together. So the word illness, it comes from a word that underscores dis-ease or disease. It's dis-ease. We are out of ease. It's not just uneasiness, it is dis-ease. We lack ease, or a sickness. So when we talk about mental illness and we smash those two words together, we could say that mental illness is a dis-ease or a sickness of the mind, or even more deeply, a sickness or a dis-ease of the whole person. That it's not just physical responses. It's not only just that, and it's not only just one's thinking, but it is the whole person. So if that's what mental illness means in terms of biblically kind of understanding it and unpacking it etymologically, then what is mental health? Well, if mental health is of or pertaining to the mind or of the soul, right? Health comes from an Old English word. It comes from an Old English word meaning being whole, sound, well, or wholeness. So when we're talking about mental health, as you mentioned, Maddie Madeline, that mental health involves the whole person, as you mentioned, behaviorally, materially, immaterially, things like that. I want to go back to mental illness for just a second. In the immaterial you can't see. You can't put your immaterial under a microscope, put a dye on it and cast it and see it. You can't do a CAT scan or fMRI scan, right? However, mental illness or a disease of the soul, illness of the soul, sickness of the soul, may be expressed materially or immaterially. For example, let's say a person has they are disabled intellectually. We can do an fMRI scan and see where they lack in terms of their cognition materially. We can see that. We can also see it in terms of possibly their speech delay, their thinking delay. They don't process information as fast as an individual would. Things like that. We can certainly see that, and that's material. However, we also have immaterial thinking, philosophy, things like that, where a person's thinking can impact how they approach things, how they perceive things, how they act. That's also important as well. So it can be expressed materially and immaterially. If a person is sick, or if they have some type of illness or anything else like that, they have a dis-ease in their physical state, we can examine that. When a person has a mental illness in terms of their thinking and things like that, we can express that or see that in how they talk, the things that they say, things they don't say, things like that. So the whole process of mental illness or mental health really is to make a soul whole or well. Your thoughts on that, Maddie Madeline?
I just want to emphasize that phrase that you just said. The point of mental health is to make a soul or the whole of a person whole again. That implies that there is something not whole, or rather, that there is an origin in which the soul is whole. Then there's a fracturing, and then our goal in the mental health field as mental health professionals is to be witness to participate in the reformation of that soul so that it may be whole again. That's powerful because in our world, in our culture, we think a lot, we talk socially a lot about mental wellness. Hey, how's your mental health going? Hey, how's your mental wellness? We talk about various different mental illnesses as well, but it's often isolated to one aspect of the human being over another. Hey, I can tell that you're seeming depressed, so let's just worry about trying to solve the physical aspect of that. But then we lack the acknowledgement of the person's philosophy, the person's way of thinking, the person's way of behaving, the person's view of themselves and God and others, which is their philosophy in many ways, their theology. And then the opposite is also true. There's often a falling on the other side of the line where we overly examine, oh, well, then you need to solve your thinking. You need to solve your theology. You need to read some more scripture. And to exist solely in one camp over the other is not acknowledging what health is, what mental health is in this bringing back together of the whole and creating wholeness for a human being and addressing the totality of the soul that is sitting, and as counselors, the soul that is sitting across from us, which is our responsibility, ethically speaking, but also I would say as believers, that's our responsibility as well, because God wants us to address the whole of the human being.
That is indeed the true aspect of soul care. I know that there are some individuals within biblical counseling, as is popularly presented, that use that phrase, soul care. And they use it in most part to refer to, I would say, most part to refer to the immaterial. But what we're trying to highlight and underscore is that soul care means the whole person, material and immaterial. If I give an individual resources, a parent resources to help them build skills so that their intellectual disability will not get in the way of things that they may do, basic tasks, skill sets, building relationships, meaningful ones, things like that. That, in effect, is soul care because I'm caring for that individual in their material needs. At the same time, if I have a believer that comes into counseling and I am addressing them using scripture, maybe perhaps explicitly, maybe implicitly, and to change their focus, I am in effect engaging in soul care because I am addressing the immaterial aspect of humanity. Consequently, if I have an unbeliever and they are thinking improperly and I use the truth implicitly to help them change their focus, I am engaging in soul care because I am using the tenets and the precepts of reality as aligned by the scriptures, even though I'm not saying a chapter and verse, but I'm using reality to help them align their thinking with that. And in effect, that is bringing them relief in some aspects. I might even have to do a combination of those, but ultimately all of those underscore soul care, all of them, because I'm using, with the language that I'm using, the questions that I'm asking, I'm using the scriptures to influence my approach towards them. And I'm also using the scriptures in line with reality to ask them questions, to give them information with the hopes and the expectation that that would align their thinking or their activity to reality, or maybe even giving them resources that will help them in that regard. Is that what you were kind of expressing when you were kind of saying that, Maddie Madeline, in terms of addressing the person?
Yeah, absolutely. In that there are nuanced and categorical, almost. Categorical might sound a little bit too service, but context, that's the better word for it. There are different contexts in which and ways in which we address the whole of the human being. But ultimately, it is an acknowledgement that we, as people who engage in soul care, are engaging with the whole of the human being, material and immaterial. And one aspect that I would like kind of some perspective on as well is the aspect of kind of going back to, we are, as mental health professionals, we are promoting the wholeness of the soul, which would indicate fracturing of some kind, some sort of disorganization, fracturing, dis-ease, as you mentioned, of the being of the person. Where does that come from, and what does that look like? And then, if we have time, how do we address it?
It's a great question. So before I actually unpack kind of the origin of we're entering into the origin of this, so why don't we just go ahead and grease the skids? We would say that the origin, from the biblical perspective, would come from sin. Now, again, we have to be nuanced with this. And like I said, if you have not heard of the episode a couple of weeks ago or several weeks ago regarding the two aspects of sin, this might be a good time to stop it and then go back and then listen to that. But I will give a kind of a summation of the two aspects, and then we'll kind of move forward from there. So the first aspect is what Maddie Madeline would refer to as the active acts of the sin nature. That all of us have this nature due to Adam, as we talked about in Genesis 3. And these are sins that one actively engages in, one actively participates in. They voluntarily do this. And we see many scriptures, Romans 1, Romans 3, 1 Corinthians 6, Galatians 5, and even some in the Hebrew scriptures of all of these actions that one participates in that essentially brings dis-ease. Now, of course, there's a difference in the economies and the administrations, whereas if the nation of Israel as a nation did something, particularly idolatry, then things would be levied against them due to them not following the Mosaic law. However, sin in and of itself is destructive because it goes against reality as God has established it. God has established reality to work a certain way. And when we align ourselves with it, things go, even in a fallen creation like this, things go well. So mental illness or the disease, dis-ease or illness of the soul can occur when one actively participates in these particular actions, particularly over a long period of time. So that's one half of it. The second aspect of sin is what's known as the passive effects of the sin nature. That even if we did not participate in any of these, we didn't steal, we didn't kill, we didn't slander, we didn't do all of these things, we would still be subject to the passive effects. And that includes sickness, colds, things as benign as that, or intellectual disability, old age, things like that, and all of the effects that happen as a recurring to old age, not being able to run very fast, the immune system dysfunction, all of these things that kind of occur as a result of us living within a fallen world. Those things impact us, even if we don't do anything wrong. And so even things like bipolar, I would say bipolar fits in this category as a result of the passive effects of the sin nature. Now, we have to make another clarification, another nuance, Maddie Madeline, in that mental illness or illness of the soul in and of itself is not a sin. It's not. So if a person has mental illness, it doesn't mean that there's some sin issue that they're dealing with. Mental illness in and of itself is not a sin. You cannot go to any of the lists and find mental illness in the list of all of those things. Okay. You can do that. However, it can also be said that sin, that is those activities that are outlined in those references I mentioned, can contribute or may even be a source to one who might have a dis-ease of the soul, depending on the context of their particular presenting problem. What are your thoughts on that, Maddie Madeline? What do you think?
So mental illness, right, is a dis-ease of the soul. The dis-ease, a disintegration of the whole of a human person, essentially, right? Up there's a fracturing that occurred. And what I'm hearing you say is that fracturing occurred, and from a theological perspective, which is I would argue from scripturally, even scripturally speaking, it says that God created us in his image. He created them male and female, that's the Mad International version of that verse. But God created humans. He created them perfect. He created them to be reflectors of him. Adam and Eve decided to redefine good and evil for themselves. Then we end up with the passive effects of sin on the whole world. And now everything in this world is groaning for the return of Christ. And everything, including our physical beings and also, our animals. An example of this is our animals get sick. If disease is affecting more than just humans with higher order thinking, the disease, that is a piece of evidence, though there's also theological backing to it, that there are these passive effects of sin which create this fracturing of the soul for every human being to some extent, in some form or fashion. But then, as I hear you say as well, Dr. Smith, there are also times in which our own thinking and our own behaving and participating in sin, active participation in sin, then also allows us to incur more fractures beyond just the fracturing which occurred because of the passive effects of sin. Is that a fair way to say that?
Yes, I would agree with that. That just like we can't single out, I know that there are some individuals that are convinced that mental illness is only one's thinking, or that mental illness is just primarily thought and cognition. That is a very lopsided view. And so just like we cannot have a lopsided view or an imbalanced view when it comes to the sickness of the soul, that it impacts the material and immaterial. We can say that all problems are a result of sin, but we have to be nuanced about what side does it fit on. So just like we're talking about having nuance when we talk about the illness of the soul or the disease of the whole person, we need to be very nuanced about where it fits in terms of the categories of what people go through and how they experience this. So, matter of fact, now that you kind of brought this up, let's grease the skids and talk about something else. I am convinced, now there could be more, but I'm convinced there are about five categories of the sickness or the illness of the soul, and in terms of their aspects of sin. So let's look at each of them and kind of explain them a little briefly, and then we'll go on and talk about how do we address each of these categories in turn. So first of all, if we are defining mental illness as the sickness or the dis-ease of the soul, the whole person, and that mental health is addressing the whole person so that they would be sound in their material and sound in their immaterial as best we can, because often we don't even know, right? But we are seeking to do that. And if the passive and active sins are passive, the passive effect of sin and active acts of sin are in play, how does this look like? Well, the first category is mental illness or the disease of the soul and active sin. So what do we mean by this? Well, if someone commits the active acts of sin because of the fact they are not thinking and aligning their conduct with reality, they will experience dis-ease and sickness. Now, when we say sickness, we're using this in a generic term. It's not necessarily, they'll get a cold or a flu, start coughing and sneezing everywhere, right? But they will experience a disorder or a dysfunction or a dis-ease because they are thinking and acting against reality. They're acting and responding in a way that is against their welfare, and as a result of that creates dis-ease of the soul. What are your thoughts on that one? For the first category is mental illness or the sickness of the soul or the illness of the soul and active sin.
So the first category, most simply put, is an individual can experience dis-ease in their being because of their participation in conduct which doesn't align with reality, or sin. That's a good way to say it. That is sinful. Conduct which does not align with reality is sinful. It's sinful conduct. What about the next aspect of it? What about when we don't have active participation?
That's a great question. And this leads us to the second category. The second category is described as poor or mental illness or poor mental health and the passive effects of sin. So think about it in this way. You have an individual who is going through chronic pain. Maybe they have rheumatoid arthritis, maybe they have Lyme disease, maybe they have, some type of illness that is chronic. And as a result, they may think that God is punishing them because of this particular illness, or they might think that they have no significance because they have this particular physical limitation. This, because of their chronic illness, this results in poor thinking and possibly a poor philosophical position based on their state. Or let's say a person may have schizophrenia and may believe or be convinced that their symptoms are demonic in nature. They have poor thinking in terms of how unclean spirits work in light of scripture because of the fact that they are experiencing these passive effects. Or, as we are going to talk to our guest in the next couple of episodes, where our guest experienced bipolar and they thought she was demonically possessed. And she thought that too for a while. So that's one way that the passive effects of sin, the sin nature, can influence an individual to have poor thinking, and that results in a dis-ease or a sickness of the soul. What are your thoughts? Would you agree with that, Maddie Madeline?
Yeah. So first form of mental illness or the disease of the dis-ease of the human soul occurs when we actively participate in conduct which essentially ends up causing us harm. That's why it's dis-ease. The second form is when there isn't any personal responsibility involved in the origin of the challenge and the dis-ease, when someone's experiencing the effects that the curse of sin had on the world, and that is affecting their way of thinking in such a way that causes, dis-ease, a sense of discomfort, and not just discomfort, but maybe poor thinking and poor philosophy about self, and that those thinking patterns then occur as a result of the physical ailments in which they have, or even mental ailments. The material ailments that they may have, or the immaterial ailments that they may have too. As you mentioned, individual with schizophrenia or bipolar.
As a matter of fact, there is an interesting statement found in the book of Proverbs. I want to jump there right quick. This is kind of an interesting statement here that the author writes. This is found in chapter 31. We kind of read from verse 19 on, right, talking about the wife of noble character, but we rarely talk about the one that is before it. So this is Proverbs 31, and I want to start at let's start at verse 4. Okay, Proverbs 31, verse 4. This is kind of fascinating to me. It says, "It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink, for they will drink and forget what is decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted." So King Lemuel, by way of his mom, who's writing kind of this wisdom of God, right, that for a king, it's not proper to engage in strong drink because when they do, it dulls the conscience. Now, he's not talking about King Lemuel's mom is not talking about the commoner. He's talking about the king, a person in high authority. So that's what he's talking about here. Now, what's interesting, watch the wisdom that she says here. Verse 6, "Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his trouble no more." I find this to be very fascinating here, that King Lemuel's mom gives wisdom in terms of not necessarily when it's appropriate to drink or not drink. That's not the context here. But in terms of giving strong drink to those who have passive effects of sin done to them, it's kind of fascinating to me that those who should have this are those who are either, kind of on their deathbed, or those who's overwhelmed in a sense of life. They're just overwhelmed with grief and sorrow to the point where they're going to collapse, or to those who are very poor. It says, and let him remember his trouble no more, right? Or his affliction, his suffering. So what I'm saying is in relation to this is that there is a sense where King Lemuel's mom understands that there are individuals that have things that happen to them that are natural and somewhat circumstantial, that don't have anything to do with their actions or activity. She doesn't say pray about it. She doesn't say, not that that's bad or anything, but she doesn't say pray about it. She doesn't say, you need to, repent of this or anything else like that. But she's like, hey, strong drink is for those in these categories, those that are overwhelmed or those who have troubles and things like that. It's the same thing with Paul. Paul in his admonition or his instruction to Timothy, put the water down for a little bit and use a little wine for your frequent ailments. He understood that there were some things that Timothy was dealing with that was biological in nature, and apparently it was chronic. It was persistent because Timothy was using water to try to address it, and it wasn't getting addressed. So Paul mentioned, hey, use some wine. So the passive effects of sin ought to be, again, they're not due to anybody's actions at all, but again, there could be poor thinking and poor cognition as a result of one suffering a great deal. But what about, let's look at the third one. There's two more, there's three more after this. Let's look at the third one. The third one is mental illness or poor mental health and someone else's active sin. Now, this is kind of interesting. So let's say, for example, a person experiences a car crash because of a person's inebriation, and they are injured. Not the person who was inebriated, but the person who experienced the car crash, the victim. Well, as a result, they may experience dis-ease in their soul, or be a diseased soul as a result of this individual who crashed, right? And that person has to experience the result of that. Or let's say a person whose relative was murdered, and that person experiences the dis-ease of the soul as a result of someone else's active sin affecting them, right? What are your thoughts on that for our third category?
I think it's important to note just how often this is a source of poor mental health or of the disease of a soul, and that it's important to make the distinctions in how we address each of these three types of individuals, and then a couple other that we're going to talk about in just a minute, is worthy of holding space for. At this moment, I do think a more robust explanation is important, but it does remind me of our cornerstone verse of admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, and help the weak. And the individual who is experiencing the dis-ease of their soul because of the active effects of sin. And quite honestly, I would even take it as far as using the word evil in some situations, not necessarily every situation, but in some situations, the active engagement in evil that someone else can participate in, which steals the ability for that person to choose the suffering which they're which is incurred upon them. And that level of evil carries a gravity to it, which, as individuals who address the soul, need to make imperative that we address that person appropriately, because to add to that individual who is poor in spirit, who is in need of encouragement in an admonishing and in a corrective way because of what they've experienced. Now, obviously, it's very nuanced to the specifics of what the person is engaging, right? If their resulting behavior is then the active participation in sin themselves, then that may need correction. But if we're talking about the source of their dis-ease being the active participation in sin from another person, we need to address that with encouragement. And encouragement doesn't necessarily always mean frou-frou-y, you're gonna be okay. Sometimes what I'm learning in my own work as, as a student of counseling and whatnot, is that sometimes encouragement looks like telling the truth, even if it's a hard truth. Not in a condemning or contemptive way, but in a, hey, evil, it requires the acknowledgement that evil has been done to you, that someone else's, that that your dis-ease is coming because someone else has chosen to participate in conduct which doesn't align with reality, and you can sense it. That is what is causing the dis-ease. And so I know I probably kind of jumped the gun there a little bit, and that's something that we're going to address later. But this is a pinpoint for me personally, but also professionally, in that I would be willing to say, to add a level of seriousness to it by saying that not just sometimes it is just the active participation of sin, in terms of, I sin against people all day, every day, because I'm a broken, sinful human, and that can cause distress for other people. And sometimes it's pure evil.
Yeah, I would agree. For instance, if a person indiscriminately smashes a person in an accident and they end up injuring that person, there was not any intent there to destroy that particular individual, yet that particular individual now has to face the consequences, right? Whereas you have a person who intentfully murders somebody or steals from somebody or harms somebody or damages somebody in any way, there is certainly some nuance there. However, it does, in one sense, when it comes to the counseling, that doesn't matter. What matters is that person is experiencing dis-ease of the soul, and we address them very differently than we would a person who's experienced dis-ease of the soul in terms of active sin, right? If that is our counseling or something like that, to that effect. So that's a great nuance to do. And yes, you did jump the gun, but that's okay though, because we'll unpack that as we go along. So I think that's a great notation to bring up. Let's bring up the other two real quick, and then I'll ask you about those. So we've got poor mental health or mental illness and active sin. We've got mental illness and the passive effects of sin. We've got mental illness and someone else's active sin, being engaged, having someone feeling the effects of that. Then we have mental illness and being impacted by someone else's passive effects of sin. Think of a death. Someone dies that is close to you, death or something like that, right? That is no fault of the person who's experiencing that, yet they find that loss to be of a great dis-ease to them. Now, just because we're saying it's a dis-ease, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong either. We're just saying that this is the state that they're in, particularly in number 4. Number 5 is kind of along the same lines of number 4, and that is mental illness and being impacted by someone else's response to the passive effects of sin. So think about this in terms of this way. A person has bipolar. That person who caretakes for them experiences that individual's affect. So they're going through mania. The person that is with them is trying to respond as best they can. And as a result, they might be failing in that, or they might be feeling like they're doing a poor job in that, or whatever the case like that. And then they may experience dis-ease as a result of this individual's passive effects of the sin nature and them being involved in that. So number 4 is mental illness and being impacted by someone else's passive effects. And then number 5 is mental illness and being impacted by someone else's response to the passive effects of sin. So those categories, I believe, there could be more, but I would say that those 5 make up a totality of how a person has a dis-ease or a sickness of the soul, and how the two aspects of sin kind of play out. Again, some of your thoughts, and then we'll jump into where we're going, and I believe it's 1 Thessalonians 5 and how each of those kind of those each of those statements in 1 Thessalonians 5 underscores this category.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately speaking, I think again our goal at this podcast is to speak to the nuance and to make distinctions. And I believe that this perspective on the dis-ease of the soul or mental illness and our understanding of sin, martyrology, whatever you want to call it, is comprehensive in terms of informing our way in which we address our counselees and making even further distinctions about how we handle their dis-ease and how to move them towards then wholeness, right? Because mental health is the wholeness of the human being, which ultimately speaking, we will never perfectly come back to, and we know that until the second coming of Christ, in terms of how we experience this world on earth during this age in which Christ is not on the throne, during this time, during this age, during this administration, how we know we will not experience the perfection and complete sensations and understanding of being made whole again. So then how do we address and guide people towards wholeness when the fracturing does occur, whether it be from the active participation of sin, the passive effects of sin on an individual, someone else's active participation in sin, which causes them harm, or passive effects of sin on someone else, which then causes us dis-ease, like the loss of a loved one through death. Or even whether it be that we're impacted by someone else's dis-ease, causing us then further dis-ease as well. I kind of briefly mentioned it before, 1 Thessalonians 5, and I typically expanded 11 through 17 because that's kind of the whole passage in which I like to address. But let's more specifically dive into verses 12 through 15, as I feel like this is a comprehensive way in which Paul communicates how the believers are to conduct themselves. And this is a teeny tiny caveat that I think is important as we're about to address this passage. Actually, I'm going to hold off on that question. Let's go through the passage, and then I have a question.
Yeah, let's go ahead and break it down. So I think that in each of the statements of Paul found in chapter 5, verses 12 and following, each of these small statements address each of the categories specifically that we just looked at, all 5 of them, which is really kind of cool if you think about it, because if we are dealing with the active and passive effects of sin, Paul seems to suggest that each of these things can be addressed. Now, he doesn't give interventions and things like that most counselors use. Like, okay, you told me the concept, but what's a tool I can use? But he does give us the general transcendent truth within the reality that we live in a fallen world, to address and approach individuals that are dealing with these particular issues. So let's look at this here. The first one is to admonish the unruly. Now, we talked about this particularly in the last episode, but also in our previous episode, where I think it was episode 3, way back when we talked about 1 Thessalonians 5. That means to instruct those who are out of order. Akatos is the Greek word. So admonish the unruly, I would believe, best fits category 1, someone who has a dis-ease of the soul and is engaged in active sin, the active activity of sin, that one needs to have their thinking and their conduct align with reality. And I would say that, would you say that that's a fair statement? Okay,
Absolutely.
so we've got that category there. The second one, where he says encourage the faint-hearted, we talked about that phrase as well, that the faint-hearted means small-souled, that one has small-souled, which is interesting. Ogliopsychos is the term, small-souled, and that they need to be strengthened, right, encouraged. So we even find that word suke in this one, ogliopsychos. I believe that this best fits category 2 and 5. That is, that mental illness and the passive effects of the sin nature, as well as mental illness and being impacted by someone else's passive effects. So and you can even put, someone else's active acts of sin too. You can even put that in there, category 3 as well, depending on the context of the counselee that you're working with. Right. Would you agree with that? Would you say that that aligns pretty well?
Absolutely,
Number
yeah.
Okay. Number three, help the weak. We talked about this, that asthenes is something physical, and help means to assist, to physically assist those who are infirmed. So I believe category 2, 3, and 5. That is dis-ease or mental illness and the passive effects of sin, mental illness in someone else's act of sin. That is, like, let's say a person is drunk and they get into a car crash and someone needs assistance or resources, physical therapy and things like that. We see that they're kind of involved in that, so we might give them resources to help with that. Or mental illness and being impacted by someone else's response to the passive effects of sin. So if someone is overwhelmed with grief and sorrow, maybe to the point where they are having physiological responses or things like that, they may have to work alongside of the doctor or practitioner or something like that to give them maybe perhaps medications and things like that. So I would say that the help the weak addresses can address category 2, 3, and 5. And then we have poor instruction. Now, we don't really talk about this a lot, but even false doctrine or poor information can bring dis-ease to a person. As I mentioned before, a person who has schizophrenia may believe that they're demonically possessed and may not be saved from a Christian, evangelical Christian perspective. And so that will bring dis-ease to someone's mind because they think that this symptomology is associated with their being saved, and as a result they might experience that type of angst. And so poor information is also involved in mental illness or a dis-ease of the soul as well, and that can be addressed in all categories 1 through 5, depending on their position and what they think in terms of their philosophy. Your thoughts?
I think I would like to add a caveat, and that's kind of the I don't know if I'll pose it necessarily as a question as much as I just want to emphasize what you said about the last two categories, in that when it says help the weak, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Greek because my Greek is not great, but that the origin of that Greek word in that passage, weak, Paul is addressing physical infirmities, someone who is infirmed. And I emphasize that caveat because I have engaged in a number of conversations myself with some individuals who fall into a particular camp in the typical biblical counseling world, which would argue that this passage is only addressing the immaterial parts of the person, and that there is that they're weak in their doctrine. And I would say, like you pointed out, yes, we are talking about weakness in doctrine, in that it says that we do need to address someone's philosophy and way of thinking, and how that is affecting their dis-ease, or how that is impacting them to have dis-ease. They can have false doctrine, which leads to dis-ease. However, specifically in that passage, it is infirm. It is those who are infirmed. It is, this gives us information that we can address the whole of the human being, the soul, the whole of the person, physical and material and immaterial. And these three categories, I appreciate your clarity on how they address all 5 of the categories of mental illness or the dis-ease of the soul. That we need to admonish the unruly, we need to admonish those who are actively participating in sin, encourage the small-hearted, encourage the faint-hearted, providing support to those who are impacted by the passive effects of sin, and who are witnessing those who are impacted by the passive effects of sin, and then helping the weak as well, and what that particularly looks like. And we finish off that last part of the verse, right? Which says, and always seek what is good for one another and for all people. Paul is encouraging the believers to seek what is good for the other believers and for all people. This passage is applicable to all individuals, which we see and who are seeking guidance and who are seeking wholeness and relief from the dis-ease of their soul. This is not exclusive to Christians versus Christians or Christians to Christians, or we need to ensure their salvation. We are to, above all else, always seek what is good for one another and for all people.
That is a great point. And also to put a finer point on your the Greek word asthenes, translated weak, and we're talking about physical infirmities and not just the immaterial or doctrinal, is the same word that is used in 1 Thessalonians 5, is used when Paul talks about Timothy to take wine for his frequent ailments. The word ailments is the word asthenes. So unless he's taking wine so that he can increase his doctrine. Hey, if you can do that, sign me up. You can sign me up for that. Also, too, this actually connects back to Proverbs 31 as well. That King Lemuel's mom giving an oracle to the Lord and telling him not to take strong drink, but give it to these people. All of that is physical. All of it. It doesn't have anything to do with what they know or what doctrines that, or the doctrines that they have, but it has everything to do with relieving their pain. It's almost the very same thing that we do in this culture, where if a person has chronic like a chronic pain, joint pain, things like that, where it's, inflammation is just, they tried everything, it doesn't work, where we give them, particularly in hospice care, we put them on, drugs to relieve them of that pain, that chronic pain that they've been experiencing for years or months or whatever. So there's a sense for that. But yes, you are right that asthenes does not mean weakened doctrine. It is always referring to some physical ailment or ailment. And I would even expand that bubble, as I mentioned before, Maddie Madeline, to include things like intellectual disability, physical defects, things like that, birth defects, things like that prevent individuals from doing things that they might need, that they could do themselves, but they might need help in. So it's illness and sickness, but I think it expands broader than that. Very, very good point. And yes, this is for everybody. It's not just for the believer, but it's for the unbeliever, that we seek the good of all people. And that would make sense if we're using reality to address individuals and helping them in their dis-ease. Of course. I mean, that would make sense. That the standard is the same no matter who they are. So that's a great thing. So just to kind of wrap up here, I know this is, again, these are kind of heavy topics. Again, if you have not listened to the two natures or the two aspects of sin and the two aspects of the human being, I would encourage you guys to go back and listen to those before you. If you've gotten to the end of this and you're scratching your head going, look, I am so lost, man. I have no idea what's going on. Again, we would encourage you to go back and listen to those two episodes and then come back and listen to this again. It will be much more clearer to you when you do that, or much more clear. Not more clear, but more clear when you do that than just listening to this outright, because there's a lot going on here. So just to summarize this here, mental illness from the biblical perspective really means a dis-ease of the soul. And we're talking about material and immaterial. And it impacts one's thinking, and it could impact one's actions depending on the category. And that mental health is really restoring one to wholeness as best we can with the information we have, the truth that we strive to align our counselees with, and to really give one strength. And then we talked about the categories of the dis-ease of the soul, and that it can be due to active sin that a person participates in. It could be due to the passive effects of sin that somebody experiences. It could be due to being the victim of someone else's active sin that an individual engages in. It could be due to a response of someone's passive sin, like in terms of death or something like that. And it can be impacted by someone else's response. That, let's say someone else dies and they are overwhelmed. That person can experience a poor disease of the soul too as well. And that 1 Thessalonians 5 really in reality addresses all of these with just the small statements that address each of these categories and the motivation of how we ought to approach these. That when a person is dealing with active sin, we instruct them passive sin or the passive effects of sin, we encourage them. And of course, when someone is dealing with things of a physical nature, that we assist them and again give them resources. And of course, wrapping all that up to be patient with all of these individuals who fit in one or more of these categories. Right. Final thoughts, Maddie Madeline, on this episode. We'll put a bow on this one. But before we do that, what are some of your thoughts on this? And then we'll wrap up from here.
Context is key. Make distinctions, understand the nuance of the individual who's sitting across from you. That's something that's a takeaway for me as I look to spend time with my counselees and participate in doing good for one another and for all.
Short and sweet. Very, very good. Yes, doing good to all people. That is the goal. All right. Well, we can wrap another one up here. This is episode, what is this, 18? 18. Man, we are rapidly approaching the 20s here. If you like the show, again, if you like what we're doing here, again, please shoot us an email at therenewedmindpodcast@gmail.com. It's all one word, therenewedmindpodcast@gmail. And we will certainly read your emails as we get them. You can also find us again on Facebook at The Renewed Mind. That is THERE-NYOO-ED. Mind. Don't forget those hyphens. And you can also find us on X, YouTube, Rumble, TikTok, and Instagram at The Renewed Mind Podcast with all of the clips of the show. And yes, that is great. Next episode, we will be talking. It'll be another solo episode. My partner in crime, Maddie Madeline, she will be continuing to be responsible with some of her things. So we will be going over an article titled Psychology versus Scripture, 5 Reasons to Glean from Both. So the last solo episode, we looked at counseling biblically as is popular, or biblical counseling as is popularly presented. Now we're going to go on the other side and look at what is known as Christian counseling. And we're going to be reading some of those things and picking out some points from there by a woman by the name of Dr. Sarah Rainier. So I look forward to unpacking that with you guys on the next episode. With that being said, my name is Dr. Luther Smith.
And I'm Maddie Clark, and this has been the Renewed Mind Podcast. Thanks for listening.
Hey, take care. Grace and peace to you guys, and we will catch you on next time. All right, take care. Bye-bye.